Hello and welcome to the U.S. History Underground. I'm Mr. O'Hagan and I'm here with Mr. Zagari.
How we doing, folks?
Today on the Underground, the culture wars in 20th and 21st centuries.
So, Mr. I was watching the news last evening, and it appears that we're in an election
You
year.
don't say. I'm kind of surprised. I haven't heard more about that actually.
Well, the primaries are intensifying, with both parties increasing their ad campaigns and the nation seemingly more divided than ever. And as I absorbed information from TV and social media, I pondered the origins of our current political climate, thinking to myself, was it triggered by Trump, Obama, or W?
Funny you bring that up, Zags. I was watching the author, TV host, and Washington Post columnist Fareed Zakaria being interviewed on Stephen Colbert. We're doing some humble brags here about what we're doing on our off time here. But
We're that cool, folks.
Yes, we are. But Zakaria made a really interesting observation about the economy being the most important factor in a candidate's electability and favorability. Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign famously had a behind-the-scenes catchphrase they used to remind all the campaign workers what was the focus of their work in that campaign. And that phrase was, "It's the economy, stupid." But Zakaria said today, 30 years after the Clinton campaign, it's the culture war that impacts candidates the most. What do you think he meant by culture war?
Well, you know what, Mr. O, I think you have to go back to, once again, 1964. And that was the year Barry Goldwater challenged LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, and unveiled the conservative response to the New Deal liberalism that had morphed into the Great Society of the 1960s. That conservative agenda would shape the political debate from that election year until this one, 60 years later.
And what do you think that conflict was about, that conservative response? What do you mean by New Deal liberalism and Great Society?
Well, let's provide some context because everybody knows you and I are the context guys.
We are.
The New Deal embraced a modern view of the role of the federal government, an increasingly national and multinational economy meant by that local control and local regulations just wouldn't cut it anymore. Our economy was too big to not have national oversight. Likewise, the New Deal embraced the idea that better opportunities for groups that had been marginalized or limited, such as women, African Americans, for example. Those opportunities now needed to improve.
Right. So by the time World War II is over, those seeds planted by New Dealers are growing. Civil rights activism, a continuation of federal authority over the economy.
Let's look at this through, again, Cold War considerations are also playing a significant role in the continued power of the federal government. Big spending on the defense budget, science and technology expenditures to compete with the Soviets. The federal government is becoming more intertwined with the daily activities of business. They're not becoming less involved.
Okay, so what's the pushback then by the Goldwater conservatives?
They really don't approve of what they see as an oversized role of the federal government. Too many taxes, too much spending, authority that used to be in the hands of, here we go again, states and local governments. It's now run by the federal government.
Boy, sounds like the anti-federalists of the 1780s and the Jeffersonian Republicans of the 1800s. Sounds like they've been reborn in this conservative movement.
So true, so true. And many of those conservatives highlight that connection to Jefferson as a way to cement their credibility, that they represent what the nation was founded for. They are real disciples of the founding fathers.
Okay, but part of that dilemma is that by pushing back against the New Deal and these programs, conservatives in the 60s find themselves ultimately on the side of states' rights and segregation and limited role for women. That's got to be a hard sell to a nation in the mid 1960s that seems to be moving in another direction.
It would seem that way until we realize that all of the activism for civil rights and social change was very unsettling to a large percentage of the population. There are plenty of people standing outside Little Rock High School trying to stop integration. Some of those people might be convinced to accept change, but at a much slower rate. And the conservatives find themselves tapping into a large base of voters who are concerned with the nation's direction.
That's a great point, Zags. I think we always, tend to think of a movement and then assume that everybody's behind it. We can't forget that there's always somebody who's not happy with the developments that are taking place.
I mean, absolutely. What we see here is now the growth of the Nixon followers. And Nixon, by the way, referred to these voters as his silent majority. And Nixon meant voters who were quiet about their preferences, but tended to be more conservative and less likely to support the pace of these dramatic changes.
And that's really the heart of this culture war, isn't it? The smaller government credo is alive and well, especially in the so called Reagan era of the 1980s. But there's a much greater focus on social issues: civil rights, the women's liberation movement, the hippie drug culture, challenges to institutions like marriage and religion and patriotism and middle class culture. The call for changes in traditional society, the rejections of traditional family values, that's what conservatives start to push back against hardest. That's what they definitely are seeking to stop.
Exactly right. One of the first organizations to pick up this banner of family values, what they called then the moral majority, and this was led by Reverend Jerry Falwell. This organization rose after the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, clearly, connecting with religion. The decision guaranteed access to abortions within the first trimester. Women's rights groups saw the decision as a recognition of the right of women to control their own bodies and reproductive rights, a basic freedom that had been denied to them. But for the moral majority, it was an attack on the family unit, the traditional role of mothers, and the sanctity of human life, that 1950s-esque America.
Right. And that battle over abortion obviously has raged on into the 21st century. Only in 2022 did we see the Dobbs v. Jackson case handed down by a Supreme Court with more conservative minded justices who overturned Roe and returned the decision on abortion back to state governments. My gosh, I just saw in the newspaper and in the news the last day or two that even Trump has come out and angered some conservatives by saying that abortion is back in the hands of the states, exactly where it was supposed to be. So even somebody like Trump is now maybe fluctuating a little bit in his position, maybe for political purposes, right? So I think what we see, though, is that some states have notably, since that decision, that Dobbs v. Jackson decision, made abortions illegal, while others have gone to greater lengths to reinforce and strengthen those rights. So with no national standard, we have an even more divided reality for abortions.
So, abortion, the role of women, the traditional family roles, all of these are part of the social issues, the cultural issues that make up this cultural war. As you know, Mr. O, American and the national identity is one of our College Board historical
It
themes.
certainly is.
So is social structures. These debates fall right under those themes.
Perfectly. Yeah.
So, what else do we see in these cultural wars?
Okay, well, sex. Calm down, listeners. It's still a U.S. history podcast. But sex, sexual identity, marriage, the LGBTQ plus community is underway in the late 1960s, and women are advocating for greater control of their bodies. For the moral majority, these advances are breaking apart the fabric of American society. The permissiveness of the 60s culture, drug use, free love. America's moral compass is no longer pointing true north to these moral majority guys. Everyone gets to decide what their morality is. Religion is being rejected by these 60s radicals and liberals. My goodness, they're no better than those godless communists, Mr. Zagari.
And there it is, the Cold War influence once again.
Yeah, George Kennan is never far from our thoughts, is he? Kennan wants America to be the best version of itself. That's what he tells us at the end of that long telegram we read. And for the moral majority, the best version of ourselves are those traditional values, not this new hippie free love stuff.
And you know what, Mr. O? I want to add something here regarding the Nixon administration. You know I can't help myself.
No, never.
And the seismic shift that we're seeing in this voting blocks. Nixon is going to use the pushback of New Deal liberalism to his advantage in both the 68 and the 72 elections. Yeah. When LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he definitely alienated Southern Democrats.
You're so right. In a famous exchange with LBJ's aide, Bill Moyers, by the way, went on to become a very well-known journalist who we saw frequently up on PBS. Moyers said to LBJ at the time, "Quite a day, Mr. President," talking about the signing of the Civil Rights Act. LBJ responded by saying, "Well, I think we may have lost the South for your lifetime and mine." Moyers would later say, It was lightly said, not sarcastic, not even dramatically. It was like a throwaway sidebar. But boy, LBJ, that political animal, he was absolutely
Yeah,
spot
he
on.
knew how to politic.
Boy, he really did predict what was going
Yeah,
to take place here, didn't
he
he?
knew the climate of America for sure.
Yeah.
And Nixon will capitalize on the rhetoric of the silent majority and use it as the basis of his campaign to attract those Southern voters who have historically voted Democratic but are disenchanted by the party's New Deal liberalism and new civil rights agenda. He will be subtle, but will aim to appeal to white voters who resented the civil rights movement.
Yeah, one way he does that is to advocate for states' rights. And there
Hey,
we
there you
are,
go, Jefferson again.
right back to Jefferson as a way to check this federal government's growing power. And by doing that, he's, by checking the federal government's power, he's giving a nod to state control over policy. I don't know, smells like Redeemers, right?
Yeah,
Go
it's that
back to
whole
the
wink wink.
right Reconstruction era. So he wants to build a conservative coalition that would bring together Southern whites, blue collar workers, suburbanites, and others who were fed up with what they saw as the excesses of 60s culture and 60s federal government. This coalition, this voting bloc, is what he's hoping is going to be reliable, and it ultimately becomes the foundation for Reagan in the 80s and this MAGA group in the 21st century, even. So, Zags, historians love to talk about change as working like a pendulum. Can you explain how that analogy helps us to understand the period from 1933 to 2023 or 2024, almost 90 years now?
Right. So now we have to trace ourselves back now to the FDR administration. FDR is ushering in the welfare state, a federal government that takes a significant interest in the day to day life of citizens and their welfare. That's a shift away from the conservatives of the 20s and that notion of rugged individualism. From FDR to the late 60s, New Deal liberalism reigned supreme. By the late 60s, the social, political, economic, and military turmoil of the era has sparked now a swing back,
Just like a pendulum.
just like a pendulum returning to its previous position.
What should we predict in the 21st century? Is the pendulum starting to swing back? Is MAGA the grenade that emboldens the left to make the next big push and get that pendulum going in the other direction again? Or is this movement just a double down of conservatism? Or are we going to see a continued growth of that era? Is the Dobbs case for liberals what the Roe decision was for
Hmm.
conservatives in 73? Is there a liberal moral majority being formed? Is there a new FDR waiting in the wings to sink the Trump MAGA conservatives and turn that pendulum back? I don't know. Only time's going to tell that in the next several years.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Be sure to use this YouTube channel for its content spotlights, unit reviews, A Push on the Road segments, and other spectacular podcasts. We'll see you next time on the U.S. History Underground.
Peace out.